Well, good morning. This is the maiden voyage for the State of the Commonwealth report, and welcome aboard. I think you'll find it interesting, but I have to, if this were a church, this would be the absolution slide where I absolve people of blame. Don't blame President Broderick or the Virginia Chamber of Commerce or even Jeff Tanner, who's the dean of the Strom College of Business right here. Please don't blame him for anything we say. This is an exercise in academic freedom. We do have some very generous donors, though, who support what we do. These are ones, I think you'll see some familiar names there. And then these are the sponsors of this particular session, to whom we are very grateful. If you see any of these people, pat them on the back, because we could not be here without them. What we're going to do today is I'm going to talk about sort of why it's good to be a Virginian right now, because we're going to be showing you some numbers that aren't quite so good. But all things considered, this is a good time to be a Virginian. Then Chip Filer, my colleague, is going to come on and talk about Virginia and national kinds of things. And then I'm going to come back on and talk about some specific problems I think you'll find interesting. For example, consolidating the provision of public services across the county and city lines, and look at our airports. But let's start with sort of the good news to make you feel good this early in the morning. This is a takeoff, of course. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere in New York City. And you'll see in a moment that New York City isn't quite so hot as they think. We're going to talk about real incomes. We're going to look at household incomes and then say, what if we deflated these for the cost of living so that we have real incomes, what you can actually spend? Well, in fact, if you look at the median household income of a Virginian, that's much larger than the incomes in New York City. It's larger than the incomes in most of the other mid-Atlantic states, whether we're looking at Charlotte or Charleston, etc. Now, this might be a little bit hard for some of you to see in the back, but at the top, look at Loudoun County and its income, and we deflate it by the cost of living index, and this is the real income of Loudoun County, $108,000. Let's go down the chart. You see Virginia at $61,000, the United States at $53,000, and then you go all the way to the bottom, and there's Philadelphia at $27,000. Okay? You go a little bit farther up the list, though, and you can see New York City at $37,000. That's Manhattan. Folks, spendable income, real income is much higher in Virginia than it is nearly any place up and down the Atlantic coast. In fact, if you look at what we have here, see Scott County, Virginia? Scott County, Virginia is a rural place, a very nice place if you've been there. It has a higher real income than Manhattan. People have more spendable income there than the typical median 50th percentile household in New York City. And it's not just Manhattan. Look at the other boroughs. In fact, look at Brooklyn's cost of living, 188.3. No wonder their household per capita income is so low. So you put all this together, folks, and the Commonwealth is not such a bad place to be right now. And keep that into the context as we're showing you some other numbers that maybe aren't quite as good as we would like them to be. What's more is that incomes are more equally distributed in Virginia than they are most other places. Now, this will also be hard to see, but all of these tables are in the report. This is the Gini coefficient. If all incomes were distributed equally, everybody had the same thing, the Gini coefficient would be 0. If one person had all the money, Scrooge McDuck or something, then it would be 100. So it's between 0 and 100, okay? So the higher the number, the less equal the distribution of income. Well, on the far right-hand side, excuse me, I'm a little bit clumsy here, you'll see that New York, Manhattan has the highest Gini index. Well, here's Richmond, but we go down here, here's Virginia, and here's Loudoun County again. Interestingly, not only does Loudoun County have the highest median household income, but it's the most equally distributed income of just about any place in Virginia. Okay? So we have higher incomes in Virginia, and the incomes tend to be more equally distributed than they are in the rest of the United States. Again, not such a bad place to be. And with that, I'm going to sit down and turn to my colleague, Chip Filer, who's going to talk about other sorts of things.
Thank you, Jim. So I'm going to put on my liberal arts hat as well. The economic report that you'll get, the chapter on the economy, reads sort of like a Shakespearean tragedy in reverse. Things are really, really bad, and then they get a little better at the end. So that's the good news. I don't think we have to say to anybody in the room here that 2013 and 2014 has been challenging in the state. On the heels of sort of coming out of the recovery, we were hit with some sequestration issues and cutbacks in federal spending. So our economic performance in 2013 and 14 was troubled, but the good news is 15 and 16 look to be a little bit better. So if we take a look at Virginia relative to the U.S., it used to be the case that Virginia tracked the U.S. fairly well, and pretty frequently would actually outpace the U.S. Since about 2013, when the sequestration cuts started, what we've seen is the state of Virginia sort of lagged the United States by about 1%. And that gap actually even opened up a little more in 2014. So the rate of growth of in 2014 for the state of Virginia was essentially flat. We actually didn't grow at all. This actually ranked us 47th out of the 50 states in the nation. We only beat out Alaska and Mississippi. Troubling, yes, but there are some pretty clear reasons behind that. Where are the contractions coming from? Where are the headwinds coming from? It's particularly in construction. So what you're looking at here are that 0.2% growth rate in GDP. How did the various industry sectors contribute to it? Some were positive contributors and others were negative. So if you're sort of half as glass full person, well then just look up here. If you're a half as glass empty person, well then you want to look at these ones down here. So construction has been a problem. It's been a consistent problem. This is not a Virginia thing. This is not unique to our state. This is every state. What is, however, unique to our state are some of these other areas down here where we have private sector industries that are highly tied into federal contracts. And I'll show you some of that information here in a second. The other thing that's been particularly true in the state of Virginia is it's been a very uneven recovery in the state. So we have a couple of our metro areas, Charlottesville and Blacksburg, that since the technical end of the recession have actually outpaced the U.S. rate of economic growth. And these are annual average percentage rates. However, the majority of all of our MSAs have lagged the U.S. as a whole. And what's particularly troubling is if you look at our three largest metro areas, Richmond, Washington, Northern Virginia, and Hampton Roads, they have all been very slow in terms of post-recession growth. So this recovery period has been a recovery, but a very stagnant type of recovery. The reason I put this slide in the report is I think it's interesting to kind of always compare us to other places, right? So this is things may stink here, but if the other states are doing even worse, then maybe we feel a little bit better. So that's what we're trying to pull off here. Maybe not effectively, but so be it. What we're trying to illustrate with this slide is the really tough situation that the state of Virginia entered into in fiscal year 13 with the cutbacks in federal spending. So the states that I've chosen here are Florida, Texas, and North Carolina for a very specific reason. These are ranked 2nd, 4th, and 12th in the nation in recipients of federal spending dollars. Guess who number 1 is? And that would be us. So what we're looking at then is a number of states that are consistently receiving federal dollars, and our state is doing substantially worse compared to those states. So relatively speaking, we not only get more dollars, we also are much more reliant on those dollars in the private sector. And so here are these contractions, and again, these tables are in the report. These contractions are up through August because there is a lag in these. But we've basically lost about 20% of the federal procurement dollars that we typically receive in the state. Where has that been going on? Well, it's our 3 largest metro areas. So if you look at our 3 largest metro areas, this economic index is supposed to be a good gauge of GDP growth for the metro area. So what I did is I looked at 2014. The index average was 2.53 for Hampton Roads. So we should have grown at 2.5%. What did we actually do? We contracted by 0.1. Guess what variable isn't included in this metro index? Federal government procurement dollars. Right? So this is an indication, albeit an ad hoc one, but it is an indication of just how reliant our private sector industries are on federal dollars. The good news for the state is that we have rebounded rather well with employment. We were a little bit slower than the nation as a whole, but we reached our pre-recession peak employment in 79 months. The U.S. got there in about 76. And the good news is we sort of cracked through it and have continued growing. Looking across the metro areas in the state, we see a very different picture. The Northern Virginia one, I didn't put that one on because it gets a little crowded, but it's in the report. Northern Virginia regained all of their jobs lost in about 39 months and have continued. The state of Virginia, again, was 76. Richmond was right around the state as a whole. But notice we have 3 metro areas that have not even recovered all of the jobs that were lost during the recession. And that's Hampton Roads, Roanoke, and Lynchburg. Comparing unemployment rates, every metro area has improved dramatically since the peak unemployment during the recession. However, what I want to point out here is every metro area is still, even at these lower unemployment rates, about 1% higher than what their typical average was during 2000 and 2007. So we're doing better, but we're not quite there yet. And some of that has to do with labor force participation. So we are seeing a number of metro areas in the state that are losing labor force. Now, right away, you sort of go to, oh, this is discouraged workers, this is a problem, we need to reintegrate them. We have to be careful here because at the state and metro level, we can't distinguish from the retirees and the discouraged workers. We do have that data at the national level, but we don't have it at the metro level. So some of what might be going on in Roanoke, if anybody's out there, is it's retirements. It might not be discouraged workers. The point here is that these changes in labor force participation are a drag on economic growth. So we need to reintegrate individuals that have either dropped out of the labor force. We need to reintegrate them back in. We present some information on sort of what performed the best and the worst during the recession, and you can take a look at that in the chapter. The common theme to this one is we are losing a lot of IT jobs in the state. Why? Well, it's probably a good chance that a lot of those are attached to DoD contracts in some manner, or federal contracts in some manner. So let's take a look at defense spending real quick overall. We basically get 2 injections to our economy from defense. We get our sort of infrastructure injections from our facilities. We get compensation. We get individuals in uniform. But then we also get this private sector stuff. And what we've learned in our recovery in this latest round of federal spending cuts is that we've gotten hit with a double whammy on this one. First of all, we've lost some compensation on average for our uniformed individuals. We've also lost compensation for individual civilians that are working with the federal and the military. We have also lost substantial amounts of government contracts to Virginia firms. So this double whammy is really what is providing the headwinds to the Virginia economy. And thus the sort of, I think the word of 2015 has been diversification. And I think you're going to hear that word a lot today probably. So where are we going forward then? Well, this is an overview of the Department of Defense discretionary spending relative to the new bipartisan act, the Budget Act that came out. So here you can see the initial bipartisan Budget Act, which filled in a little bit of the sequestration hit. Then here is the new one. And what I want to point out here is that while this relief has been helpful and it is provided some benefit back to the state, we are on this very weird sort of 2-year cycle of what ifs. what if it, and so you can see here again, by the end of fiscal 17, if we don't have a new agreement that's reached by Congress, the growth in government spending between fiscal 17 and 18 will actually decrease, not increase. So let's talk about the port quickly, and there's more information on the port in the chapter. The port has had a great year. This number was early, that we got these numbers a little bit early, but the port closed at about $13 million for fiscal 15. A dramatic turnaround from the loss of $15 million the previous fiscal year. An enormous amount of TEUs being handled by the port. Very good growth in TEUs. This spreads then all throughout the Commonwealth. This is not a Hampton Roads thing. We have all of these entities that benefit from the services provided by the port. Tourism and hotels has also been a very bright spot. So if we take a look at the hotel industry, they've had a very good 15. Right? We have RevPAR, which is the revenue that's available for per available room. We have that at $67 currently. Now that'll trend down a little bit because we'll get data from November and December that gets averaged in, and those numbers are usually a little lower. But it's still going to be much better than 14. Spending across the board, just in tourism, direct spending in general, has been fairly strong in all of the regions within the state. The Eastern Shore has had a terrific 2015, or had a terrific 2014. Now, we talked about the housing market briefly with the introduction. So let's take a look quickly at some housing numbers. Well, you can see here, comparing Virginia to the United States, Virginia has just been more volatile. That's the only way to say it. We grew at a much faster rate in the pre-contraction. We fell at a much faster rate than the U.S. during the contraction, and now we're increasing at a slower rate than the U.S. as a whole. The main drag on that is both supply and demand. So we do have a little bit lower demands in the state. We also are having a much smaller supply of new homes in the state as well. So building permits is important because this provides kind of a leading indicator of that construction sector. That's been our weak spot. Building permits gives us some indication of where we're headed. This number was as of October, so this is 16,663. For November and December, we typically average about 3,000 new permits. So we're looking at this number coming in at the end of 15 at about 19,000. It will be below the 21, which we hit in 2013, but 19,000 is not a bad number. That is a number that will likely trim some of that contraction, some of that drag from the construction sector in 2016. Now let me talk about Northern Virginia quickly. And we have a whole chapter on Northern Virginia, very well done by the guys at George Mason University. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But one of the interesting parts of that is they take a look within the Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia metro, how much of the economy is some way attached to the federal government. And basically, to answer that question, you can take a look at all of this gray and add it up. Right, so we're looking roughly at about 40% of the Northern Virginia, D.C. economy that is in some way directly tied to Fed spending or in a manner producing for the federal government. So what does that mean for average job growth for the Washington metro area? It's lagged a lot of the other metro areas. Dallas has seen job growth year over year of 4.4. D.C. has come in at 1.5. That's the drag on federal spending. So again, just like we looked at for the whole state, this is Northern Virginia. Same story holds for Richmond. Same story holds for Hampton Roads. Same story holds in all of the metro areas. The good news, as with the original one that I showed on Hampton Roads and with Hampton Roads, Richmond, and Northern Virginia, all of the leading economic indicators are pointing to a much better 15 and an improved 2016 as well. So let's get to our forecast, sort of the meat of this. So we produce 3 forecasts within the center. We do a national forecast, we do a state forecast, and we do a Hampton Roads forecast. Something tells me we're going to be doing some other MSAs here in the near future. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, but I think so. And so what I want to show you here is what our projections are for 15 and then our forecast for 16. So we're anticipating the U.S. economy to come in at about 2.4% growth. That's about flat. That's flat from 2014. So 2015 is 2.4, and then about 2.9% in 2016. What's the story then for Virginia? You know, it's sort of this 1% rule. We're going to have about 1% less than the U.S. as a whole. We expect us to radically improve over 2014 to grow at 1.3% and then get about 1.98% growth afterwards. So what should we be working on sort of moving forward? I get asked a lot, you know, is this like a Pittsburgh, Detroit? Is this what we're headed for? The answer to that is unequivocally no. It is not. We do not have a situation in the state of Virginia where our private sector is producing goods and services that private entities do not want. We just have a situation where our private sector is producing goods and services that they've been able to sell to the government for years and years and years. That's the transition that's going to have to take place in the state. So, you know, it's going to be painful, but it is not impossible. We are in a much better position than these cities and states that have lost entire industries. So that's the sort of nice part at the end. That's reading the Shakespeare backwards part. And with that, I'm going to turn it back. And again, the report has a lot of information in it as well that I didn't cover. But I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague.
Thanks, Chip. Each of the topics I'm going to cover now is a separate chapter in the report. And let's start talking about airports. This is the bad news. Virtually all of our airports, save Reagan, have been suffering declining patronage. Now, the good news, however, is that in 2015, several of them have sort of turned that around. In Hampton Roads and Richmond, for example, both of them are experiencing increases in patronage, but we're still pretty far below where we were. And of course, Newport News, Williamsburg suffered because of the withdrawal of a major carrier. But if you look at the 4 largest airports, and these data come from the Wall Street Journal, if you look between 2007 and 2014 in Richmond, a decline in the number of seats and a rise in fares, the same pattern in Norfolk, the same pattern in Washington, D.C., National, Reagan, and of course in Dulles as well. Dulles is the airport that probably faces the greatest challenges. You can see, for example, what's been happening. Reagan's been catching up to Dulles. Why so? Well, it's basically a function of congressional decisions. Congressmen and senators love to go right from the Capitol to Reagan and then fly wherever they want in the country. Okay? And this is also happening, incidentally, in terms of air traffic for mail and freight. But there's this perimeter rule that used to exist, that you could only fly from Reagan, roughly about 500 miles. And then if you wanted to go further, or if you wanted to go internationally, you had to go to Dulles. Well, that rule has gradually dissipated, and so Reagan's been taking flights away from Dulles. It's been getting slots, and so Dulles is suffering. In fact, the Washington Post said it was in trouble. I think that's a little bit strong, but it does face some pretty specific problems. Okay? Now, at the same time, there are other factors that are pretty obvious. Airlines have increased their profitability because they've increased their load factor and the like. And so there are other things that are happening here, but our airports are a vital part of our economic development efforts. Without good airports, without good connections, it's very difficult to sell people on locating in Virginia or doing their business here. So this is a problem I think the Commonwealth and the General Assembly need to pay more attention to, and I think we need to get the Congress to sort of lay off Dulles a bit. Okay? Let's next talk about a topic which is, I think, a very interesting one. There are lots of people here from local governments. And no doubt the question has arisen in your minds, well, what if we shared the provision of services with that neighboring city or with the county? What if we collectively offered some of these services? Well, there are lots of different governmental units in Virginia, 95 counties, 39 independent cities, and 95 towns. And sort of the question is, well, what if we did some of these things together? Would there be economies of scale? Could we save money and maybe increase the quality of services? Okay? So those are the sort of the questions I want to address today, and to tell you that we have a sample of all these thanks to the Auditor of Public Accounts, who publishes some very good data on costs of doing business for about 25 or 30 different services. And so, being economists, we did some statistical analysis and said, okay, what if we began to do some of these things together? Would we in fact realize any of those economies of scale? Now, the first thing we adjusted for, though, was really the cost of living. I showed you some of those cost of living indexes before, and there are some dramatic differences. And the fact, let's say, that Loudoun County is spending more money on a particular service than, let's say, Franklin, doesn't necessarily mean Loudoun County is less efficient. It's just that things are more costly there. So the first thing we did is to adjust for differences in the cost of living. And then we controlled for 11 other factors that aren't necessarily related to efficiency, but they would cause one particular city or town to spend more money than another, relating, for example, to the nature of the population or the size of the city and the like. Okay? Let's look at this now. And you're probably saying, God, this guy is an economist. This looks like Econ 101. This is one of these graphs I didn't like. Well, maybe so. But this is the average cost per capita of supplying a service. In this case, it's administrative and general financial services. The median-sized governmental unit in Virginia is only 25,000. That's the 50th percentile. So half of all the units out there supplying services are smaller than this, okay? And half are larger. Well, you can see Galax with a population of 7,052. This is its per capita cost of supplying these services. And here's Danville, and here's Richmond, and here's Virginia Beach, and then here's Fairfax County. Okay? Well, if you plug these numbers into the right kind of program, it will generate this sort of graph for you. And what it tells you is that there are economies of scale in providing these services until you get to about 640,000 people. That's the minimum optimal scale, as an economist would say it. That's probably the size to which we could grow and realize economies of scale, make things less expensive. Okay? After that point, it appears as if things get more expensive. Now, a very important caveat here: there really aren't any cities and counties between Virginia Beach and Fairfax County. So this is the program saying, this is what we think this function looks like, but there really aren't any actual observations there. Okay? Well, let's look at a very different kind of services, maintaining roads, bridges, and highways. And again, 134 cities and counties. I'll give you a different selection. Here's Augusta County, here's Arlington County, here's Virginia Beach, and here's Fairfax County. Okay? And so what you see is this kind of a relationship, which suggests there are not major economies of scale until you get really pretty large. So if we looked at this particular service, we'd say, well, I'm not quite so sure that merging things together would make sense. Okay? Pretty well constant costs there, so merging the provision of this service might not make a whole lot of sense. But this is what the curve looks like then. And so if you could merge things together beyond a population of roughly 240,000, you would realize economies of scale. But there are only a couple of places in the state where we could do that. Mainly Northern Virginia, Richmond, and Hampton Roads are really the only places where we could bring those kinds of things together. So this particular service isn't one that would be of great help to people who aren't in those larger metropolitan areas. But without going through all these kinds of graphs, because this really isn't Econ 101, these are the ones that we ought to be looking at according to our statistical analysis. It appears as if there are significant economies of scale of the sort that it pays people to talk about getting together and providing those services together. We have this data set there and would be happy to share and work on that with people who are interested. Let me now sort of go to another little aspect of this, though. Could we look at these data and make some inference about who is efficient and who isn't? Well, sort of. Not completely, but let me show you what we can do. If we look at the overall index of the cost of providing all the services, the overall state average is 97, the county average is 82, the city average is 137. Now remember, I've taken into account differences in the cost of living. So cities are spending more money than counties to provide the same service. Of course, maybe it's not exactly the same service, you might say, and that's quite possibly true. But let's take Lynchburg as an example. Lynchburg is actually spending 103. Our model says, based upon their characteristics, we might expect them to spend 111. Well, they're doing this more efficiently than we would predict. Why? Well, either they really are more efficient, or maybe they're providing a lesser level of service. Okay? They're just not doing as much. Or look at, let's say, Winchester, bigger gap there. That sort of would make me want to ask, if I were Winchester, well, what are we doing here? Are we really more efficient, or are we simply doing it a different way? On the other hand, Northampton County is spending more than we would predict, given their characteristics, those 11 different things we were controlling for. If I'm in Northampton County, I would look at this and say, hey, maybe we're not doing this the right way. Or maybe we should be doing it along with someone else. Okay? Let's segue now and talk about people moving. Mobility between metropolitan areas. And here's sort of an interesting question. If you're a Virginian, okay, in 1900, 92% of you were born in Virginia. Now in 2012, only 49% were. Quite a difference, okay? There aren't so many native Virginians anymore, are there? In fact, they are not a majority any longer within the Commonwealth of Virginia. This is for 2012. We had 312,000 people move in, okay? 250,000 moved into a metropolitan area in Virginia from outside of Virginia. Roughly males and females the same, but if you look down here, the interesting thing is they tend to be younger and better educated. In fact, 75% of them have at least a bachelor's degree. So when people are moving in and out of metropolitan areas in Virginia, they tend to be the better educated people. Okay? Where are they coming from? Well, neighboring states, but look at California and New York in particular. Those are states that are having economic problems. They have net out-migration. So we're attracting people from places that are losing jobs or having problems. But if you look where people are leaving for, again, it's the neighboring states and places like Florida and Texas. In terms of counties, the pattern that Chip was talking about before in terms of the influence of federal expenditures, look at the counties that have net out-migration. Fairfax, Norfolk, Newport News, Virginia Beach, Hampton. These are the military cities, aren't they? The federal spending cities. Those are the cities and counties that are losing residents, or at least have been over the last few years. Whereas the ones farther up to the top don't have the same level of federal activity going on. So why do people move? Once again, being an economist, we did a statistical analysis. There's an economist named Charlie Thibault who's dead. And Charlie said something that is blindingly obvious if you think about it. People vote with their feet. They don't like where they are, they move. Okay? And what they might not like is they don't have a job, or they don't like the amenities, or the taxes are too high, or whatever. But we looked at 358 metro areas, and it turns out that job availability and job growth is the most important factor. No mystery there. But this economic freedom variable is kind of an interesting one. There are some economists that have developed an index. And this index reflects how easy it is to open a new business, whether you can get into a profession without too restrictive licensing, labor union strength, right to work states and things like that. And they have this economic freedom index. I'm going to show you some numbers in a moment. And that turns out to be quite important. The more freedom, the more migrants you attract. And the quality of the amenities. And this includes schools and roads and all the conventional kinds of things. In our analysis, not so important factors. Size of the metro area didn't make much difference. The cost of living didn't make much difference. And taxation levels didn't. Now, I don't mean to say, incidentally, that taxation levels never make a difference. But if you don't have a job, you're not so worried about what the marginal tax rate is in Texas or wherever. You're simply going to go where the job is, which is a different question than asking, well, having high marginal tax rates for 10 years in a row might be a problem, as places like New York, for example, are finding now. But in terms of this economic freedom index, the higher the number here, the higher the level of, quote, economic freedom. Okay, you can see the national average about 6.5. Richmond, interestingly enough, I wouldn't have guessed this, has the highest economic freedom index of any of the metropolitan areas within Virginia. What about Richard Florida? Now, in Richard Florida's defense, let me say he sells lots more books than I do. But his variables don't explain hardly anything. And I'm not going to beat this into the ground except to say that lots of economic development people fell in love with Richard Florida and invited him and gave him large fees and so forth, and his variables don't explain hardly anything. Let me come back to this business of tax rates. Tax rates make a difference in the long term. For example, in 2014 alone, the state of New York had a net outflow of 153,000 individuals. Now, yes, there are other variables like climate and so forth involved, but tax rates in the long term make a difference. But in the short run, if I don't have a job, I'm not so worried about what the marginal tax rate is. I simply need a job. Let me finish up by talking about small business. With the cooperation of the Virginia Department of Commerce and Trade, we looked at what's been happening to small businesses in Virginia over the last 25 years. And let's look at this graph. It'll give you somewhat of an idea. Okay? Now, these are small businesses. The blue is 0 to 4 employees, and the red is 5 to 9 employees. So these are really the small guys out there. And you'll see that these percentages have been going up or remaining roughly constant. What that says is the percentage of all the businesses that are out there that are small has roughly remained the same. So small businesses have been able to survive, okay? But if we look at the percentage of employment they account for, you can see that this has been going down in many cases, whereas if you talk about 500 plus employees, it's going up. So the small businesses are existing, but they're not expanding as rapidly as the large businesses. Indeed, our particular research showed that once you get to about 10 employees, it's almost like there's an invisible wall there. They have trouble scaling beyond 10 employees and really growing beyond that point. So I think in terms of public policy, that ought to be something that we focus on. How do we get these small businesses who are able to start, how do we get them to grow? A final thing I want to show you is not just small business, but business establishment. New business establishments are going down percentage-wise, not just in the United States, but in Virginia and in most of the metropolitan areas inside Virginia. We're not founding as many new businesses as we used to. And this is a problem because ultimately is related to our economic prosperity and to our growth rate. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and try to keep us on schedule. And we're, of course, open for questions later. Thank you.